Welcome to Commsverse. This session is called Taming Microsoft Teams with Document Management, and today will be presented to you by Chirag Patel. Chirag, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Anup. Thanks for that. Hi, everyone. I'm Chirag Patel. Glad to be here at Commsverse and hope you're having a good conference. So, as Anup mentioned, my session's about taming Microsoft Teams with document management. So, welcome to my session, and just wanted to thank the sponsors. In particular, all the sponsors who's been giving up their resource in this online event. So big thanks to them, otherwise it wouldn't happen. And also big thanks to Mark, Randy, and Martin for going through a lot of efforts to bring this event to us. So I'm Chirag Patel. Just recently been MVP, but I live and work in London. Mainly work with Office 365, SharePoint through deployments, migrations, and so I tend to do community work, mainly speaking, and obviously just recently launched a new user group in the UK for Microsoft 365 UK. My details are there. techchirag.com is the best way to get in touch with me. On Twitter as well. So yeah, that's my details there. I also tend to, I mentioned, speak at a lot of events, so I'm kind of grateful to some of these community events that happen around. It's the only way my learning happens, as there are very little amount of books that we can read. But yeah, the links are there to all my slides, YouTube recordings and everything else. So if you do get time, please do check those out. So what we're going to cover in this session is really the main part of its document management in terms of what it looks like in Microsoft Teams, which I'm sure a lot of us are using that on a daily basis. So I won't go through in the basics of the introductions of that, but we'll just cover through that very briefly for those who are new to SharePoint or OneDrive, the use of it. We'll obviously look at the practicality of working with document management, depending on the size of the organization. You can have the big discipline around it as to how your documents are classified, and all the way down to a member of staff who can, create their own little document management capability within their own chat workspace within the SharePoint site. And then we'll look at the how you can go about extending that further in order to how you can best organize, classify your information for better findability and search. And then we'll wrap it up with the security and compliance of it as well. The big part of this presentation is obviously with some introductory slides in the beginning, but also is covered through the demonstration. So there's not that many slides, but all the links, everything is posted throughout in each of these slides. And then at some point you can get access to these slides as well. So all will be there. Okay, so very briefly, Microsoft Teams, which is obviously part of Microsoft 365. There is plethora of apps and services and tools. And depending on what you're trying to achieve with your the modern workplace, if you like, then you can use these tools in a number of ways. I tend to, when I work with various organizations, tend to kind of put this in sort of disciplined way as to your internal communication, collaboration, both internal and external. And so you can sort of slot your tools and apps and services based on that in terms of why you're rolling out those particular tech. But we're going to be focusing mainly on the document management side of things. And that's just an example where a lot of the organizations use file shares. They're moving to SharePoint Online, Teams. In some cases, they're using both the systems, and you have the duplicates and triplicates and what have you. So we can focus around, what type of information your organization might work with. We all do projects, we all do contracts, agreements, We all have our own departments, our own information. So we can look at that and to see how best that can be organized and how we can sort of make it work for you, because the benefits are huge in order to kind of not just being compliant to your organization, but also being able to work with those documents more efficiently. So briefly, Microsoft slide on Microsoft Teams, what it is, what it can do. Yes, it can do chat, calls, meetings, collaboration is the big part of it. When you look at the difference between Skype for Business, in terms of that, it brings your SharePoint and all the other apps and connectors and everything else together. Yes, you can customize it. You can use your SharePoint framework to create your customized projects. And obviously the whole thing is wrapped around with the Microsoft 365 security and compliance on that. So it's really kind of, if you like, your hub for teamwork, which is what we do. It's where we go to do our work. And then when you look at SharePoint, then from a SharePoint perspective, yes, it is all about content. Yes, we basically do files, folders throughout the time. It can do pages, so create your intranets, and there are some good examples out there. You can also create your lists, so you got your Excel lists that gets updated constantly, bring that into a SharePoint list like your web tables, and you can create umpteen number of sites, the SharePoint sites on the basis of it, and obviously furthermore customize that to your needs and everything else. But really it's your kind of a content collaboration hub, if you like. So they're not viewed separately, they're both together and they work together. When it comes to creating those, SharePoint team site, you may not create them knowingly. So if you do create Microsoft Teams chat workspace, it's going to create a SharePoint site for you, but that's equally applicable to Planner as well. So if you do create a Planner plan, that's going to create a SharePoint site too, as well as even Outlook groups. As far as if you're a user, you don't really care as long as you're able to do your job and create those things, that's fine. But from an administration perspective, you may end up having so many teams or groups in the background and therefore resulting in that duplication of that. So this is just one of the ways they can create your SharePoint site around that. So when you do create a SharePoint site, again, this can be a session on its own, but generally when you create your teams, your SharePoint sites created, you get a single document library with it. Within that, you have your channels, so your general channel and additional channels that you create all resides in that single document library. Yes, you can also, if your organization is allowing you to externally share, instantly you can just go and invite your guests and then start collaborating. And then you kind of off you go from a collaboration perspective, whether that's your projects or client work you're doing or any other matter. You then go and extend that further by adding more news pages, creating report pages, or even just creating a page for a set of documents, a few notifications around it or activity, and bring that page into your Microsoft Teams chat workspace. So we'll take a look at that briefly in a second or so. But above all, it's not just a SharePoint thing. Just like Teams, it also integrates with other technology tools in Microsoft 365 as well. So it's basically giving you that integrated experience, and wherever you are, whether you're in Outlook or Teams, you still have access to the same files. So they're no different to that at all. So let's take a look. So if I look at my Microsoft Teams chat space here, so I've got a number of teams here, and you can see that from a document management perspective, first of all, it looks a bit of a clutter because there are so many topics going on. I've got engineering here, I've got the research department, build, Europe sales, London, Paris. It's it's fairly flat structure. There's no real hierarchy in that. Some of those might look related, but you couldn't really tell from within Microsoft Teams. But if I wanted to go into, say, contracts, for example, and go into the general channel, then perhaps I might be able to access my files relating to my contracts. And that's okay because I know the files that I'm working on a daily basis, so I can kind of get access to those. And likewise, if I go into my Files tab on the left-hand side on the app toolbar, then obviously I've got my Teams related files in terms of the recent files that I've worked with without having to go into SharePoint. But you can see over here that on the location clearly marks as to which particular SharePoint site that is. So as far as you're concerned, it doesn't really matter which site it is. As long as you've got access to your SharePoint for those files, then you're kind of good to go. And that's OK from a document perspective. So if I go back to Teams, then what we're going to look at in a sec is that the difference between the files in OneDrive and the Teams itself. So I'm just going to head back very quickly to the slide and then come back again. So when you store your files in there, OneDrive and SharePoint, and often what happens is that you can have like your OneDrive files, which is private to you by default, and you can do all your work and everything else within that. But then when obviously the files itself, they don't reside in Microsoft Teams as per se, because that's just a view for it. It resides in the actual SharePoint itself. But within the SharePoint itself, all your files, your files within the channels are stored in that document library folder. So that's one thing to kind of really understand to begin with, that your document management as such doesn't really happen in that space. For sure, you can use it for collaboration, get your files up and running, have the conversations, the chats, and that's OK. But you have other ways to kind of extend that further. And then obviously, once you've kind of got that, if you like your one-to-one colleague chat files you have, then those will reside in OneDrive itself. So these are ad hoc chats and not really a team as such. So that's kind of just a distinction around the difference between OneDrive and SharePoint in terms of where those files actually reside. And I've seen an example where somebody in one of the retail organizations that I was working with before, they actually had the entire marketing department running on OneDrive because it was easy for that user to exchange graphics, materials, contents for the agencies that they were working with. And when the migration happened, they couldn't find their marketing department on their SharePoint because the OneDrive was not migrated before from their previous versions when they were going through the mergers and acquisitions. So it's just to kind of give you an example where you should store things in SharePoint if it's team related and organization wide. But if it's only for personal things, then obviously OneDrive is for that. When you look at the life of the document itself, for sure you create your documents in OneDrive, and that's okay. No, there's nothing wrong with that. You go through a few edits, and then obviously you share it to a couple of colleagues. The traction happens, more collaboration happens, and then eventually you got to make a call as a user that if that needs a team itself, whereby you can then move that particular file into that team that has got created for you, which in essence is a SharePoint site that you store your files in. And so once you kind of share that file inside your SharePoint site, you then have obviously access to the whole team who can see that file. And you can then obviously, to that effect, delete that file from your OneDrive. And then obviously you get that X amount of time or years whereby you may apply the retention policy to it. The document either gets archived or get deleted. And that's kind of a short view of end-to-end, if you like, how that document goes around it. Not to say that applies to every single document, because in some cases you probably you go into SharePoint team site first to just start creating your documents. So not everything has to be created from OneDrive, but it's there should you need to, and then move it into SharePoint. So why document management as such? It is a capability. There is no real kind of a feature or a module to say switch on, you get document management. It is something that you've got to define, and the way you define it, if you're a large organization, you really obviously then have to go through exercise of creating that structure so that all the teams, the sites, everything else gets that kind of capability for all those things. But these are kind of, if you like, the basic questions around, if you're working, if you have a file share already, then how do you kind of organize your files? Are they set kind of consistent structure of your folders? I know finance department, they do a good job of it. They have like their months and periods and all those kind of files organized in that way. And so if you use some kind of a third-party tools, migration tools, you can do a quick analysis around that to understand what kind of folder structures you have, extract all that information into a CSV file, and then kind of study that in terms of what are the common associated keywords, which are your folder names, if you like, and then just to try and understand the frequency of what is the most active kind of folders, subfolders, or the content that's been used. So you can use that as one of the drivers as to how you go into your document management capability within the SharePoint itself. The other type of things is we work with files, don't really care whether it's a contract or personnel record or what have you. As long as it's a file, you know where to save it, you kind of go and work with it and you kind of job done, or maybe even email the files out to the colleagues. But it's kind of obviously then you have to go back and understand, okay, well, if you do have any information about your files and what kind of information that is, so if it's like look at your drop downs, are you looking at any lookups to kind of tag them, whatever it is. Once you get a kind of a clear picture as to what drives the content in your organization, then you've got something to work with. Now, this obviously applies from an organization perspective, but if you're a user in a particular department, that might hold you back to go into your document management. The good thing is that within the SharePoint site itself, by your own means, you can do that. So you can have your own version of document management, if you like, for your project or whatever it is that you may want to do. So it's flexible from that perspective, organization all the way down to the user level. Okay, traditionally, for those who are in the SharePoint kind of background, usually you try and make this more seamless experience. So you have your intranet site, you may have your HR finance department site, as well as your internal communications, for example. And these can be Microsoft Teams themselves as a chat workspace, but at the same time, those SharePoint sites in the background can be the hub sites, which is basically the way to group your SharePoint sites. So we'll just look at that now as to what this looks like. So when we were in Microsoft Teams here, we were saying that there's no real flat, there's no way of looking at the hierarchy from that. So what we would do is basically go into the actual SharePoint site itself. So if I go into my Europe cells, Europe cells. So if I go in my Europe cells, this is the SharePoint site behind it, and that's nothing new about this. It's just a straightforward SharePoint homepage. You got your news, your activity, and links and documents and everything else. Now, in this case, you got their navigation. I can customize that navigation to include additional links here, but I know for sure that within the Europe cells itself, I've got a few sites associated with that. So within that, I've got documents coming out from the London site, which is also a Microsoft Teams chat space, but also I've got other things in there as well. So if I type in notes, then within notes, I've got files coming from my contracts, which is a team chat workspace, as well as I've got London there, and maybe more if I go into that. So from the SharePoint perspective, I've got all those sites related, and I had to define that structure. I make the Europe cells as a hub site itself, and then being able to bring all the other sites into it by joining them as a hub site itself. And the way I kind of do that is if I go into my SharePoint admin center itself and go into my active sites, and here I can just choose any site I want, but in this case I chose Europe cells, and in the toolbar here I've got my hub settings here, so I can literally pick that site, which every one of these team sites is a Microsoft Teams chat space, and I can make that as a hub. So it's basically the head of the family, so to speak, that becomes the head of the site. So it's like the first port of entry. And then I can just go into my the London site, for example, here. So if I go into let's say Paris, Then in Paris, I've got my, on the right hand side here, I've got my Europe sales associated with that. So this is how in SharePoint I can define and group my structures within that. So that's kind of one way of organizing your sites from that. So that structure that we looked at. So this is probably an example of how you can go into further into defining all that kind of structure. So here I've got the engineering, research, build. So you saw some of those team chat space. I can go through the hub associations, and I can have many hubs and also many sites associated with each of those hubs there as well. So this way I've got my sites organized based on the organization level, as well as through the locations, if it's a multinational organization, or even through functions as well. So if I got HR in, say, London, Paris, elsewhere, then I can have that function site. It doesn't really matter what that kind of structure is. It's still a flat structure. Each SharePoint site and the documents within that are still securely controlled, and only those individuals who's got permissions to it can actually see it. So this structure is more of a kind of a cosmetic of it, because the hub site itself will give you kind of that shared navigation experience and the search across all the sites within that hub. So it's kind of a good way to organize that from a starters of the document management capability. The magic ingredients in here in terms of that document management kind of experience is clearly the metadata and content types itself, and we'll cover this in a bit of a detail around that. But all your metadata are they're your columns to your files. So the popular ones tends to be the created date and created by and so on. Those are all metadata attributes. So here's the one going back to our file share examples, where if you know your folders, your subfolder structures, everything else, once you've all that gathered, then you can actually understand what kind of things to create. Yes, you can still create folders. There's obviously an argument between folders versus metadata. The advantage there with metadata is it helps you to bring the search capabilities more richer itself, and being able to filter items on those metadata values through the use of web parts. So you got the key kind of web parts around the highlighted content web parts, which we will look at in a minute, but also other areas of the actual document library where you can organize your views to basically sort and filter your files instead of displaying all the files itself. And then you obviously got the search experience as well. So the whole search experience is powered by the Office graph. So when you go into your SharePoint landing page or even the start page, you got all those experiences powered up through that graph, which as a user, you don't really need to know or understand that, as long as you know that you're able to select your sites automatically or manually itself in there. So I'll be kind of going through that, and then obviously you got the compliance and retention as well. So you want to be able to classify that, if it's confidential or highly confidential, as well as through your retention labels, if it's a personal records and so on. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go to demo again. So come out of the admin center. So for this, I'm going to go back to my Teams. So I've got a demo site here for contracts. So if I go and expand my contracts team general channel, then within my general channel, usually you'll get just the two tabs, posts and files, which you can't change. But if you go into files, then really in here, all you're basically seeing is your main document library that you have inside that contracts file as well. So those are your files, and there isn't a lot in here as such that you can do other than to basically go into other areas to create your additional library. So if I look at this experience, open that in SharePoint, then it takes me obviously straight into my general folder, which is your channel in there, and those files in there that I've got, excuse me, can use that for collaboration, that's fine. But in addition to that, what I've done is I've created another document library by just creating a library called contract repository. So within this repository here, I've got my, these are obviously different files. They look the same, but I can treat them as different files altogether. But here what I've done is I've actually added the additional columns in there. Now, as far as the user goes, I've got my review dates, so I've got kind of when to review next. I can associate my files to a specific client as to who that contract belongs to. I've also got information about purchase order numbers there as well. So if there's a purchase order associated with a contract, I can put all that. So it still becomes, if you like, a bucket of my document library with all the files in there. But also I've got things like sensitivity and those kind of columns as well. So I can bring all those things in here. And that's kind of, if you like, that's where we want to get to. And this is only for a specific document library. And in some cases, I can reuse some of these columns in another SharePoint site as well. So that's kind of where we're going to get towards. But just before I kind of go and show you how that's done, I just want to kind of cover a quick kind of basics around that. So when you look at the content types and metadata in terms of what they are, so essentially content type, it's kind of pulling that together on items. In this case, this is our sales contract, for example. And with that sales contract, we know usually there's a salesperson, there's the client itself, purchase order, and these are all your columns that you're going to create. But essentially, they're like your attributes. So they made the same thing, formerly known as metadata, and that's how you kind of really, if you like, group them around. When you look at those columns itself, there's a number of ways of creating them. In your library, you can just click on add column, choose what type of information you're going to put in, whether it's going to be just a yes or no, a number, or anything else. But there is a kind of, if you like, kind of a hierarchy around that in terms of how you go about organizing, because not every document that you have is going to be called just a Word document. If you look back our repository here, and if I click on new, then I've got a few options here that says I can create a sales contract, or I can create a construction agreement, or even a fixed price. And these are kind of set content types that there are. So I can associate a template associated with that particular type. So every time I create a sales contract, it's going to give me that lovely laid out template to that. I can do all that and not having to kind of copy or paste from a previous document and so on. But also what I can do is I can then go in to have different properties, those metadata itself. So by that, what I mean is that I can create a parental organization type document. So I can call that my org document. I can then have that available either in all the SharePoint sites behind every team, or I can go and create something that's just unique to a SharePoint site only, so that I don't want anything else to be available elsewhere. So I can decide that in terms of where I want to do that. But we know that we do all types of contracts. So I'll create a contract itself as a content type. And based on that contract content type, I can create additional contracts as well with the unique values. Because, for example, with sales contract, I don't want the salesperson and client company or even the PO number to come across to this generic contract itself. So I may want to choose different things for different types of content. And you can only come about with this kind of structure if, when you're migrating from your file shares, knowing what kind of folders and structures, what kind of templates you work with, only then you can bring about that change through this kind of structure itself. The screenshot there I've got is something that's gone recently modernized in SharePoint, but for those of you with SharePoint, that's just our term store, which is basically our managed metadata. And that's very powerful in terms of that when you do create your columns itself, you can either create your choice-based, or you can just create that term store. And that's kind of goes in a bit of a depth more around how you can create different levels of your terms, which you can then use that to tag itself. So let's take a look at that. So what I wanted to show you first here is that I'm just going to create my document here. So I'll create sales contract document. For this particular demo, I don't have a template, but it could have been a template. Yes, we'll open that standard document. It is a blank document as expected, that's fine, but I could have had that template. And we'll just say sales document. And I can just give it a friendly name, Commsverse sales document. That's going to write back to my repository in there. But while I'm here also, I can have my sensitivity labels here that's available to me. So I can have either my personal or general, depending on what it does here. So in this case, I will just go and choose confidential. So then on the bottom left on my screen, I've got my label applied there as well, which in this case is applied automatically through this particular site. Now, it doesn't actually contain confidential data itself, but for the actual site, that's kind of how it's kind of configured in there. So it can do it automatically, or you can do it manually there as well. So if I go back to my library now, and so within my Commsverse document itself there, if I go into my information pane here, then within here, I've got my attributes that I've defined here. So I've got content type, which is sales contract, because that's the document I chose to create. And because it knows it's sales contract, so with that, it's able to pull up that, not just the review date, but also the client and the PO number as well. If I go and show you another one, let's say HSBC instructions, for example, and if I scroll there, then on the right, it's got marked as document content type. So it's just plain out of the box you get as a document content type. But within there, I don't get prompted whether it's the review date or even the PO number as well, for example. So I only get to fill what's applicable in there. Obviously, all the files are staying in one place. That's fine, as long as everybody needs to get to it. Obviously, if you do want to split that into, say, different document library, then you may want to create additional libraries to secure that further if you wanted to. Or you can apply permissions, which I wouldn't really recommend, but you can then apply permissions to each individual files. But the idea here is you can actually split that around as to how you do that. The way that this has come about, if you like, so if I go into behind the scenes, if I go into my library settings, then every document library that you look has got its own settings there as well. This is obviously after enabling the content type here. This is how I'm able to feed all my types here. So I've got my sales contract, construction agreement, and so on. But if I was to click on the sales contract, which is the type that I've defined, then you can see that within that content type, I've defined review date, client, and purchase order number as well. So I can add more if I wanted to, which means that every time I create a document, I get those pieces of information filled out. And that's okay. But whilst I'm here, then I can also show you just on the right-hand side that each of these fields, the attributes that's coming in here, from a user perspective, they don't really care how that's all coming through. But when you do define these things, then in this case, I've made it unique to this particular document site itself, but I've also got my org document in there as well. And then I've also got document. And these are all the sources of how that hierarchy of content types that I have that I can define. And the way you then go about doing that is you do this at the site level. So you would try and avoid as much as possible to try and create local columns if you can at the library level, unless you're not going to use them elsewhere within your SharePoint site. So if I go back to my site settings, and this takes me to the actual, as an owner for that team, I can access my site columns and my site content types. And those attributes we saw was within the site columns itself. Now, this is something you get part of your SharePoint site. There are loads of them you can use, which you don't have to really create a lot of them. But in my case here, I created a few of them within custom columns. And this is where I created all my things in here. So you can see that client here is using managed metadata type, and then I've got my PO number, which is using the actual just the number type itself. So I can define all my columns, if you like, within the site as an owner, all in one place. Once I've created all my site columns that I want to use in my document libraries, then I would go back and create content types so that I can start using those columns into my content types. So if I click on site content types there, again, you just like columns, you get all the content types you have that you can use. A lot of them are kind of legacy from the old days of SharePoint. I doubt you very much if a lot of them are getting used, but in this case, I've created my own custom content types, and within that, I've got my set of types there. So construction, agreement, contract, and so on. And I can add more and use them later if I want to make them available to my SharePoint document libraries itself. So I've got about 5 of those here. And this types of content that you have is not just limited to the SharePoint site, but you can also have it at the organization level as well. And for that, you would define that inside your SharePoint Administration Center. There is a dedicated SharePoint site for it called Content Type Hub, but that's obviously an experience that's getting rolled out. So far, what we've done here is just created all over the metadata and the content types all inside within this one SharePoint site. I haven't gone to the engineering site or London site or Paris site. This is so far as an owner, I can do all this within my SharePoint site. But if I now go back to my admin center itself, the SharePoint admin, and there we're going to look at the actual term store itself. So if I go into content services, in my case, I haven't got my content type hub yet. That's still getting rolled out. Last I checked, Microsoft Admin Message Center, as they've delayed slight rollout for that, but it should be here in the early July, so it's basically anytime now. But what I do have here is something called term store. And so with the term store, this is your corporate dictionary. So here I've got my 2 types of term groups here, corporate clients as well as corporate document. So if I expand my corporate clients, I can define my client term sets as well as my client type as well. And I can define as an administrator for the organization for SharePoint, that can be reused across all the SharePoint sites. Then I can define that structure here. I can also do this at the site level, by the way, but for now, we're just going to concentrate on the SharePoint sites level for all the sites. So here within the client, I've got my ABC Core, Care, Limited, everything else. So those values are essentially coming into my SharePoint sites within the site columns. So if I go back to my site columns and my custom columns there, so I've got my client type. They're both coming from that term store. So if I click on client, so when I define my site columns itself, then by going in here, one of the areas here is the term settings there. And this is probably as far as it will go within here. There's nothing to do here in the sense that you define exactly what your drop downs should look like. So you choose client, which was defined at the SharePoint administration level. But then here I can see all those values coming through all the way from there. So it's the same source we're looking at. We're not defining anything new. We're just reusing those values defined there. And here's the one I can customize it to make it unique just for this SharePoint site and not for others to be used. So that's kind of, if you like, gives you kind of a brief, kind of quick tour, if you like, around how you can bring your columns, your types of information in the files within that itself. So if I go back to my slide there, then within my slides here, then you can see that you can bring, as simple as it is for that SharePoint site, you can bring your columns, your content types all together, and then give that kind of experience around how to manage that document and its properties itself. The The last section around this is obviously enabling the document governance around it, because this again can be done at the organization level, target specific SharePoint sites or all of them if you wanted to, and then be able to apply the retention labels and sensitivity labels as well. So when I went into my document, I created my sensitivity label very quickly. Classify that information. But if I go back to my compliance center with all those files in there, then I can go into my admin center, actually compliance there. If I go into my compliance center, and as a compliance administrator, I can go into here, look at my data classification. So here I got my labels are supplied in a particular state. So I've got my 4 sensitivity labels there. I can go into view all of those labels that I've got in there within SharePoint or OneDrive in terms of where that's going. I've also got information around the sensitive info that it's got, the credit cards, and then all those things. So as the compliance administrator, I can get a good view how the labels are being used, and also being able to then go further into the areas of defining other additional information protection areas like the DLPs and all those things as well. If I go into Content Explorer very quickly there, then within the Content Explorer, I can see all the locations and the folders where a particular type of information that's been applied as well. So these are all my sensitive info types that I get within the tenant. I can start associating those to create my DLP policies and then be able to see where that information actually lies inside here. So in this case, I've got 126 files that's got the classifications of all those types in there. So again, some of this is quite new, but I've also got, scrolling down, I've got sensitivity labels used in a specific area. So again, it gives me a count of 4 personnel records, if you like, and then within Exchange as well as SharePoint. So it's obviously beyond SharePoint within here, but hopefully that's kind of given an idea as to how that kind of security and compliance pieces, if you like, kind of brings together. So again, there's a sessions about this in its entirety, but really kind of that's where you want to get to with your document management experiences to kind of start thinking small and work your way to it, to being able to design your document management experience for that. A lot of the materials that I've used in this session, and there are further info links as well, so you'll find them into this particular set of links. But obviously, in the meantime, do check those links out. And I just want to say big thanks to all the attendees, and thanks for joining my session, and Anup for helping to produce this session, and also Commsverse and the sponsors, the organizers, everybody for making this happen. So slightly overshot with my time, but I think if you have any questions, let me have a look, then start giving them. But yeah, so look what we got. Hi, Anup. I don't see any questions, so I guess.
Yeah. Thanks, Chirag.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was very informative. Yeah, I don't see any questions. We've got a couple of minutes. After that, you can join Chirag in the breakout session. I'll be posting the link for that soon in the Q&A section. Yeah, let's give the attendees a couple of minutes if they have any questions.
Yeah, sure. It's obviously a lot of material to go through in what, last 40 minutes. So there's a lot to take in.
Right. Have the link for the breakout session ready. Okay. Okay then. So Chirag, thank you again.
Yep.
It was very informative.
No,
So
thanks for having me.
No worries. I've posted the link for the breakout session. You can join Chirag over there.
Yep, I'll join over that now. Okay, that's great.
See you
Thanks
guys.
everyone. Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, Arnold.